Not all victims wore crowns. While history remembers the queens who lost their heads, it often forgets the countless ordinary women who were dragged behind those stone walls, never to return. These weren't noble women or political threats. They were wives of traitors, midwives accused of witchcraft, maids who whispered the wrong rumor, or women who simply spoke too freely. For them, the punishment began the moment they entered the gate. Their long hair, often a symbol of their identity, was hacked off without care. Not as a formality, but as a warning. You no longer belong to yourself. You belong to the tower. The cells were not just cold. They were tombs for the living. Some women were thrown into damp, rat-infested dungeons without trial, awaiting a sentence that never came. Others were starved, shackled, or forced to sit in silence for days, weeks, even months, until their minds began to unravel. They weren't tortured with fire and iron like men often were. Instead, they were slowly broken from the inside out. And when the sentence did come, execution was rarely swift. While noble women like Anne Boleyn were granted a clean death by sword, common women often faced the axe, and not all executioners were skilled. Some botched the job. It could take 2, 3, even 4 strikes to sever a head. In Tudor England, a woman didn't need to commit treason to earn a cell in the Tower of London. Sometimes, her crime was simply speaking. A careless remark, a whispered suspicion, or even a spiritual vision was enough to sign her death warrant. The Tower became a cage not just for criminals, but for inconvenient women. Speaking out, especially against the king or church, was considered dangerous, and for women, it was unforgivable. Take Elizabeth Barton, a nun known as the Holy Maid of Kent. She was no criminal, just a devout young woman who claimed to receive divine visions. But when her visions dared to challenge King Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, the crown turned her into a threat. She was arrested, imprisoned in the Tower, and dragged before Parliament. Her words were rebranded as treason, and she was executed. Hanged like a common criminal, her corpse left swinging as a warning to every woman who dared to raise her voice. Then there was Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, an elderly noblewoman with royal blood. She committed no crime herself, but her family's association with rebellion was enough. She was brought to the Tower under flimsy suspicion, imprisoned for years, and finally executed at the age of 67. The execution was so gruesome, it was almost a punishment in itself. The inexperienced headsman struck her again and again, 10, maybe 11 times, chasing her terrified body as she tried to flee. She died not just in pain, but in horror. And these were the women with names history remembered. Countless others weren't so lucky. Wives of suspected rebels were locked up not for what they did, but for who they loved. Servants accused of overhearing secrets or repeating gossip were treated as spies. Some were arrested merely for being present in the wrong house at the wrong time. And for the poorest women, there was no trial, no record, no defense, just a cell, silence, and slow decay. Not even queens were safe from the Tower of London's wrath. In fact, wearing a crown made your fall all the more brutal. Anne Boleyn and Katherine Howard, both wives of King Henry VIII, entered the Tower not as prisoners of war, but as women condemned by love, betrayal, and power. Their fates weren't just sealed by politics, they were shaped by the cruelty of how they were treated inside those ancient walls. Anne Boleyn arrived at the Tower on May 2nd, 1536. Just 3 years earlier, she had entered those same gates as queen, celebrated and adored. Now she returned as a traitor. The charges against her were outrageous: adultery, incest, even witchcraft. But the real crime? Failing to give the king a son and falling out of favor. Anne was kept in the queen's lodgings, a more comfortable set of rooms. But it wasn't kindness, it was control. Every move she made was watched. Every word she spoke was recorded and twisted. She was interrogated repeatedly, her closest friends arrested, tortured, and forced to testify against her. Inside the Tower, Anne's spirit began to crack. She prayed constantly, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. She was denied visits with her daughter Elizabeth and left to pace the stone floors, knowing her death was being planned step by step. Her jailers kept her hair short, her clothes plain, and her dignity just intact enough for a spectacle. On May 19, 1536, Anne was led to a scaffold built specially for her. Unlike most executions, she was granted the mercy of a French swordsman rather than the English axe. It was considered more humane, but it was still a performance. Her final words were calm, practiced, but beneath them was the echo of betrayal. One clean stroke, and the woman who once turned England upside down was reduced to a lifeless body on the Tower Green. Just a few years later, Katherine Howard, Henry's fifth wife, followed the same cursed path. She was barely 17, young, naive, and swept into court life without preparation. When rumors of her past relationships surfaced, they didn't just cost her reputation, they cost her freedom. She was arrested and taken to the Tower in the dead of night. Unlike Anne, she was not given private quarters. She was imprisoned in Celsa Tower, alone and terrified. Katherine begged for mercy, screaming so loudly she could be heard across the courtyard. She wasn't allowed legal counsel. She wasn't allowed to face her accusers. She was simply told she had dishonored the king and would pay the price. The days before her execution were filled with dread. She asked to practice placing her head on the block, trying to accept the fate that awaited her. On February 13, 1542, she was executed with the same axe Anne Boleyn had escaped. One report says she said, "I die a queen, but I would rather die the wife of Culpeper." Whether true or not, her death was the final act in a story written not by her, but by the men who controlled her. Inside the Tower, these women were stripped of power, pride, and personhood. They weren't treated like criminals. They were treated like curses that needed to be erased. Their beauty, their ambition, their independence, it all became their undoing. The Tower didn't just take their lives, it crushed their legacies, leaving behind a bloody memory and a warning for every woman who followed. Even queens can bleed. In the deadly game of Tudor politics, women weren't just collateral damage. They were pawns to be moved, sacrificed, or silenced. And for Lady Jane Grey and Princess Elizabeth, the Tower of London became the ultimate symbol of that betrayal. Jane didn't ask to be queen. She was only 16, bookish, obedient, and deeply religious. But she had royal blood, and that made her dangerous. When King Edward VI died, power-hungry nobles saw Jane as a puppet. They placed the crown on her head, hoping to block Mary Tudor's claim. Jane ruled for just 9 days before Mary marched into London and claimed the throne. Jane was arrested and taken to the Tower, not to rule, but to die. She was imprisoned in the same royal apartments she had stayed in as queen, but this time they weren't gilded halls. They were a waiting room for death. She was cut off from her family, stripped of her titles, and assigned guards who reported her every move. Despite her fear, Jane refused to convert to Catholicism. She clung to her faith even as the noose tightened. She was told that if she repented, she might live, but she wouldn't bend. On February 12, Jane was executed on Tower Green. Eyewitnesses say she remained calm as she climbed the scaffold. But when she was blindfolded, she panicked, unable to find the block. "What shall I do? Where is it?" she cried. A bystander helped her place her head. Moments later, the axe fell. She was 16, her crime being too valuable to the wrong people. History remembers queens. It names them, grieves them, sometimes even glorifies them. But for the nameless women swallowed by the Tower of London, there are no plaques, no portraits, only silence. These were the wives of traitors, daughters of rebels, midwives accused of heresy, and women caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. They were not royal. They had no armies, no enemies at court. And still they were imprisoned, punished, and left to rot inside the cold stone belly of the tower. Their crimes were often invisible. Some were arrested simply for refusing to inform on their husbands. Others were taken for being seen in secret meetings or for allegedly aiding fugitives. And many were punished not for what they did, but for who they were related to. Once inside, there was no ceremony, no special lodgings. These women were crammed into small, lightless cells deep in the belly of the tower, like the Cold Harbor Gate or the Bowyer Tower, where moisture dripped from the walls and rats gnawed in the dark. There were no beds, no clean clothes, and no contact with the outside world. Their hair was cut off, their belongings seized, and their identities erased. Most were never officially tried. They were held under suspicion, denied the right to speak, and left to waste away. Starvation was a common punishment. Some were allowed a crust of bread a day. Others were given just enough to keep them alive, barely. If the king's council needed answers, fear replaced torture. Threats of execution or watching a child harmed could extract any confession. Some were made to witness the execution of loved ones. A message: speak or suffer the same fate. And when they died, whether from sickness, despair, or starvation, their bodies were often dumped in unmarked graves. No ceremony, no record, just buried under the tower grounds or tossed into the nearby river under cover of darkness.